There we go. All right, so thank you all for joining us here tonight. Tonight's program is called A Look Back at 1939, Hollywood's Greatest Year. Take a behind-the-scenes look at Hollywood's greatest year. Relive the premieres of The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gone with the Wind. Look back at that year's top films and its stars and directors with movie buff Frank Mendoza, who will share his popular presentation filled with photos and trivia. Frank is a full-time Massachusetts high school film and English teacher. Definitely a difficult time to be a teacher right now. So thank you, Frank, for your service. We appreciate it. He has been given film lectures at libraries, senior centers, and community centers across the state since 2012. Frank is also the co-host of Real Life, that's REEL, an award-winning local access TV show that features movie reviews. So all 35 of us or so, let's give a big round of applause to Frank for joining us here tonight. And Frank, you can take it away.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Robert. And thank you all for being here tonight. I know that it's a June evening, so the fact that you're here, something I really very much appreciate. I do want to begin by saying thank you to the Tewksbury Library as well as the Friends of the Library for making a program like this possible. And as Robert just said, and as you can see on the screen in front of you, tonight's program is 1939, Hollywood's Greatest Year. And my name is Frank Mendoza, and I'm plugging this now at the beginning. I'll have this again at the end. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, I have my hashtag, not my hashtag, I'm sorry, my Twitter handle, FilmBuff1974. And Facebook, I also have a Facebook page, a movie page, public, and just type in Silver Screeners and you will see everything movie related there as well. So let's get right down to it without further ado. 1939, Hollywood's greatest year. I wanted to have a fancy movie themed backdrop, but the best I could do was this facade that I have taped to the wall behind me. I don't know how well you can see it with the lighting, but it's meant to look like the red carpet with the velvet ropes lined along each side. But it seemed fitting, given the fact that 1939 is smack dab in the middle of what is oftentimes called the golden age of Hollywood. So diving right in, why 1939? What is it about this year that makes this year so special? And it's not an easy question to answer because, let's face it, anytime you use the words best or worst, strongest or weakest, it's all subjective. It is all subjective. But 1939, by general consensus, by film critics and film buffs alike, tends to be the year that, as Lisa Schwarzbaum in Entertainment Weekly said, was a year in which the, quote, the cosmic alignment blessed Hollywood. One dazzling year. And I could go on about 20 to 25 different films, but we would be here for 3 days, and I respect your time too much for that. As much as I would love to go on, I knew that keeping it focused on arguably 4 of the greatest from 1939, zeroing in on these 4, I think would be the best way to go. So it was a given that The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind would make the cut. As far as the other 2 slots, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Stagecoach. It hurt. It hurt to eliminate from the list other classics that I could certainly include, including Gunga Din, Young Mr. Lincoln, Ninotchka, The Women, The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, Dark Victory with Bette Davis. I could go on, but these 4 films will be the focal point for our discussion tonight. And of course, at the end, if you do have any questions, if you have questions about the other films, hey, if I know the answer, I will certainly tell you what I can about those as well. Okay, so 1939. Film critic Leonard Maltin, maybe you've heard of him. He publishes, for years now, he has been publishing the annual edition of his video guide. He refers to 1939 as the year that everybody went all out, meaning Technicolor, location shooting, bolder stories. Movies that were showing that production costs and budgets, which would affect everything ranging from sets to costumes, to the quality of the film itself, the actual visual of the film itself. This was the year where they began really to go all out. And you do have to keep in mind, 1939, this was a pivotal year for a couple of reasons. Number one, America was ending the decade of the Great Depression, which certainly had a huge influence on movie attendance in this decade. And number two, even though the United States would not officially enter World War II until after Pearl Harbor, which was, of course, December of 1941, that didn't mean that there weren't already the inevitable whispers here in the States. I mean, will we be entering the war ourselves? How much longer until we can, we have to stop remaining neutral. The memories of the First World War certainly hanging like a dark cloud over a lot of people's heads, people who are old enough to remember it. So a lot of the historical context also factors in, I think, to a lot of the types of stories that were being told by the late 1930s. So I do have here a little wish for all of us. So go ahead and click your heels 3 times, and I'll paraphrase Glinda the Good Witch. We're not going to say there's no place like home, because I'm going to assume that we are all home. So there's no year like 1939. So let's take it away. Let's go back to all those decades ago. We're coming up now and almost, not quite, but almost 100 years ago. We're looking at, 81 plus years. So, in order to fully get a lot of the stories that I'll be telling you, the behind the scenes stories about these 4 films, I probably should begin, the best place to start would be to explain the way that Hollywood tended to function. Hollywood was known as the dream factory, sometimes as the dream machine, because stories would be put up there on the screen for audiences to flock to, and really to eat up and enjoy, to be entertained, to see all of these fantasies, all of these melodramas, gangster pictures, big budget musicals. It was an escape. All of it was an escape, primarily from the economic stress brought upon by the Great Depression, the political turmoil that was going on around Europe that was beginning to reflect in a couple of films from 1939. I refer, for example, to I don't know how remembered or how forgotten this one is, but there was a 1939 film called Confessions of a Nazi Spy. And so, there were some political films that were being made. All these years later, looking back in hindsight, they tend to be shoved under the rug in favor of the more glossy, Technicolor, big budget spectacles like Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. But as I said, Hollywood was the dream factory. It gave people an escape from reality, escapist fare, if you will. And as far as how the financial piece of film production went, it was all what was called the studio system. The studio system, which, to put it in more general terms, everything was a contract. If you were an actor, Bette Davis, Clark Gable, Vivien Leigh, if you were a director, Victor Fleming, Frank Capra, John Ford, you had a contract with one movie studio and you made films according to the contract for that studio and that studio alone. You would sign, for example, a 2-year contract with MGM, or maybe you had a 1-year contract if you were first starting out with Warner Brothers. Or if you really had a lot of clout and you were really at the top of your game, maybe you might even have a 5-year contract. But it was always with the same movie studio. So here's the thing. The studios contractually, they retained the right, and this is important to understand, particularly with Gone with the Wind, the studios retained the right to sort of basically with each other to barter, to trade and barter. I mean, you were chattel. So I might have a 2-year contract with Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers and MGM MGM might come to the table together, and MGM might say, hey, we want to borrow film lecturer Frank Mendoza. And so if you let us borrow him, he's your contract player, but if you let us borrow him, we will pay you X amount of dollars. And sometimes agreements could be reached, and sometimes they would not. Sometimes negotiations would end, and everybody would leave the table. Sometimes agreements would be reached, and they would sign on the dotted line, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that was the studio system in a nutshell. The other thing that should be mentioned about the contracts, they had what was called morals clauses. And this will come into play with Gone with the Wind as well. Morals clauses. You were contractually obligated to maintain a public image. The studios kept files on you. And if they did not like any part of your true background, oh, you were born in the year, I don't know, you were born in the year 1905. Oh, well, that'll make you, X years old. Let's shave 2 years off your life. So they might officially release in, the press releases that you were born actually 2 years later than you actually were. Or as far as the morals clauses go, if you were ever caught in a scandal, you could lose your career because there was a very tight grip on the studio's part on your personal life. And we'll get more into that, particularly when we talk about the casting of Scarlett O'Hara as well as Clark Gable. More on that later. So as I said, our approach will be taking a look at those 4 films, and then I'll be giving you a brief overview of that particular year's Oscar night, which was held on February 29th, leap year, 1940 at the Ambassador Hotel. So that's how we'll conclude with a look at which of these films won which Academy Awards. All right, so let's dive into It's a Wonderful Life. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. There'll be a few shout outs to Wonderful Life. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, directed by Frank Capra and Jimmy Stewart, who made several films together, including It's a Wonderful Life. I'll begin with the basic premise, which I promise you will be spoiler-free. Everything tonight will be spoiler-free. So for the benefit of those of you who may not have seen these movies, or if you haven't seen them in a while and you forget a lot about them and you want to revisit them with a fresh perspective, rest assured, no spoilers here. I'll just give you plot setups and the basic premise. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is billed as a comedy, and it certainly has a lot of comedy woven into the script. But there are certainly some dramatic moments as well, mostly of a sentimental nature, which was very much Frank Capra's style, and I'll explain that too. Basically, as the movie opens, the very first image you see after the opening credits is that a senator has passed away. And so the whole idea is he needs a replacement. Now, there is another senator by the name of Joseph Harris Payne, and he is played by Claude Rains, who already impressed vocally a few years earlier with the horror classic The Invisible Man. He plays the titular Invisible Man. Claude Rains plays a senator by the name of Joseph Harris Payne, and he and a crony of his by the name of Jim Taylor. By the way, it is not an accident that these are very quote-unquote Anglo-American names. These two men are involved in an illegal land grabbing scheme. They want to buy up all of these parcels of land and hold them under dummy names, under phony names, and then sell these parcels of land under these names back to the state. And they want to make all of this legal through legal loopholes, details of which are not important. Basically, they want to bury it in this huge piece of legislation that involves other issues, and that way they can just slide it under the rug, under the carpet, and everything will be nice and legal. That's their plan. So why is that important to this movie? All of this is explained in the first 5 or 6 minutes. They need a stooge. They need to have the replacement for the recently deceased senator to be someone who is young and inexperienced, and someone who will not catch on to what it is that they are trying to pull off. As Claude Rains' character puts it, the replacement cannot any questions or talk out of turn. We've got to be absolutely sure of him. We have to make sure that we'll be able to play him as a puppet. So, there is probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie actually occurs at the very beginning, because it is a great satirical look at crowd manipulation. They are surrounded by a huge crowd, these two men, and this crowd is composed of veterans committees and citizens committees, and they have all of these questions they keep asking to fire up the crowd. Do we want to go with somebody that we can't trust? And the audience screams out, no. And he says, do we want to go with someone who does not have your best interests in mind? And they say, no. And he says, yes, you're exactly right. So we want to go with this guy, Joe Smith, who is a beacon. And they all scream, no. And they jump back because they thought until that last second that they had the crowd. So it's a great comedic moment. Later on, the governor is having dinner at his home. There are all these kids there, and they are encouraging him, oh, you've got to go for Jefferson Smith. And the governor says, who the heck is Jefferson Smith? I've never heard of this guy. Oh, he's the head of, it's all right here. He's the greatest American who ever lived, all these accomplishments and things he can do. He is the biggest patriot. He's a hero of all the kids. And long story short, the governor hears, he listens to the kids and he says, okay, well, he says to himself, after dinner, he flips a coin. Heads I go for him, tails I don't. And in another great touch, and again, this is all within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, a great touch. This is the way the coin lands. So the coin lands on its side against a stack of books. I have here this frame grab from the film of the way that the coin lands. So, and that's how Jimmy Stewart literally enters the picture. So here they are standing in front of another crowd at a banquet, really is there for the benefit of the press. And they're saying to the governor, give the position to some wealthy, influential citizen. The crowd goes, no. He says, did he give it to some unworthy political hireling? They say, no. And he says, you're right. No, he didn't. He went down among the people and there he found a nugget. So you have here that awkward moment of Jimmy Stewart saying, oh, I'm a nugget, am I? Gee, thanks. And that's Jimmy Stewart's first appearance in the picture. And in this very same scene, the boy rangers, in a very sentimental moment, they present him with a gift of a briefcase and in a wonderful show of the wholesomeness and the naivete and the idealism of Jefferson Smith, as well as the boys. The boy says to him so innocently, this briefcase is for you to carry around all the laws when you get to Washington. And so, of course, everyone has a good chuckle over these lovely children, and the boy tears up, and Jefferson Smith tears up, and the band launches into Auld Lang Syne, and that's when the story really begins to get underway. I will not say anything more about the story beyond that basic setup of the first 10 minutes or so. So now that I've given you the basic premise of the film, I can tell you a little bit about the background. First of all, it had its origins as a short treatment written by Louis Foster. He had written it in 1937, and the title of the treatment was The Gentleman from Montana. And he was shopping this treatment around to different studios, and the studios were all turning it down. No studio wanted to touch it. And one of the reasons why is because Hollywood knew that if a film with as much political content, especially if it's political content in a satirical light, if it might ruffle a few feathers, then maybe you don't want to screw around with that too much. Was the precaution. The production code, which was an early version of what would eventually become the Motion Picture Association of America, that organization that to this day assigns film ratings. Rated PG-13, rated R, etc. The production code had its list of rules as well. And Joseph Breen, who was the head of the production code, he read the treatment. He read this short treatment, and he hated it. And It's right here on the screen, the way he felt about it. Unflattering portrayal, the most un-American thing you can imagine. It's an attack on democracy. And so the head of Columbia Studios became interested. And Harry Cohn, who at the time was the head of Columbia, he took the script and he said, you know what, let me work on it to make it more, acceptable to mainstream audiences. And so Harry Cohn was really the one responsible for putting in a lot of the sentimental touches as well as the more comedic touches. Now, here's where the studio system and the contract system comes into play. The original choice for the role of Jefferson Smith was not Jimmy Stewart. It was, in fact, Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper and director Frank Capra together had done Mr. Deeds Goes to Town a few years earlier, and so this was originally envisioned as a sequel to that, hence the similarity between the two titles. Gary Cooper, however, he was under contract with another film studio, with Sam Goldwyn of MGM, and Sam Goldwyn, the G in MGM, Goldwyn, they could not reach an agreement. Gary Cooper, as far as the salary was concerned. So Gary Cooper was out. And what's interesting is the female lead of this film, Jean Arthur, was also the female lead of Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. So she actually wanted Gary Cooper too. She would have loved to have done another film with him. Jimmy Stewart was, for her, not quite an established star, not yet. Oh, sure, he had done a couple of films. You Can't Take It With You, for example, but he wasn't quite as big as Gary Cooper was. So Jimmy Stewart entered as soon as Gary Cooper exited. The opening credits of the film, it's a page torn right out of the Americana songbook. So if you just go onto YouTube and play the opening credits alone, you'll hear Yankee Doodle Dandy and My Country 'Tis of Thee, a nice little medley. Play it out the window on the 4th of July, you'll be the most patriotic house in the neighborhood. There is a there's a montage, I should say, a montage of images, which is basically a free ad for Washington, D.C. for the tourism industry. They filmed on location in D.C., the Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol building, all of these images of all of these famous landmarks. But all of the scenes that take place inside the Senate chamber, this was a set that was built. It was Columbia's most costly set at the time, but Frank Capra, the director Frank Capra, pictured right here, he wanted realism. He wanted he wanted audiences to wonder, was this filmed in the real Senate chambers? So as far as the costs were concerned, he pulled no punches. So a lot of the budget went into the set construction. The fact that Jimmy Stewart was not an established star and therefore did not command as high of a salary, that certainly helped to balance the books, to balance the ledgers. So, Frank Capra, the director. Perhaps you have heard of the not so flattering term Capra-corn, which film historians and film buffs have sometimes used to refer to Frank Capra's tendency in his films to get very sentimental. And for some people, perhaps they may feel it actually goes into the territory of schmaltzy, corny, sentimental. That was his trademark. And with good reason. Frank Capra was an immigrant. He came to the States with his parents at the age of 6. He came from Sicily. He did fight in World War I for the U.S., and he taught math actually to the U.S. Army for a while. He had a stint as a math teacher in the Army, and he was the first in his family to go to college. And for him, his life became the American dream. He cherished American ideals, and a lot of that is reflected in the idealism and the optimism that you see in so many of his better known films. In fact, his degree, if I'm not mistaken, was in chemical engineering of all things from the California Institute of Technology. I have here images from a scene at the Lincoln Memorial, perfect example of Capra-corn. On the right, that's Jimmy Stewart. I don't know how well you can see, but it's Jimmy Stewart standing there with a hat in his hand, on the right, the image on the right, I mean. And there are two unnamed characters, a little boy with an older man, presumably a grandfather, and they're visiting the memorial, and in a very sentimental, maybe schmaltzy, maybe not kind of moment. The little boy is reading the inscription that, of course, encapsulates American ideals, and the music is playing, and Jimmy Stewart's watching him, and he's finding it inspirational. And while the little boy is reading this inscription, you have on the left-hand side, you have this African-American man, also unnamed. None of these three characters have any lines of dialogue. Well, the little boy does, but he comes along and he takes off his hat. And although it may seem a bit, depending on, the way things are with, with 2020, in 1939, this really was much more the exception than the norm. To have an African-American character in a pivotal scene enter a film and not be a servant or a maid or a butler or the comic relief in slapstick comedy. The fact that it was a dignified moment for 1939, that was very progressive thinking on Frank Capra's part. Once the movie came out, World War II came and went. In the mid-40s, Frank Capra further pursued his American dream. He formed his own film production company, Liberty Films. Unfortunately, the first film he made under this banner, which was It's a Wonderful Life, was a terrible box office disappointment, which is amazing. I still to this day cannot believe that. But It's a Wonderful Life, when it first came out in 1946, was a box office disappointment. As a result, he ended up selling Liberty Films to Paramount Studios. He did retain the status of producer, but Paramount contractually had the creative control. They had final say on scripts, and they had the final say on budgets, and all of that. So Capra bitterly lamented that there's no such thing as complete independence unless you put up your own money and basically risk going bankrupt. But here we are now in 2020, still talking about him, still talking about his body of work. So certainly he's had an influence on film history. As far as initial reaction to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the preview screening was at Washington's Constitution Hall, and it did not go over so well. There were many who took offense. They felt that it was an affront to democracy. They felt that it ridiculed politicians. They felt that it was propaganda for the Axis powers in these immediate pre-World War II years. So there was a lot that was negative that was thrown at the film. People were walking out of the preview screening. There was even one newspaper editor who got a few drinks in him at the screening, or maybe it was right after the screening, and he actually attacked director Frank Capra because he was upset that a drunken reporter was one of the characters in the film. So I always found that very, very ironic. But as far as I have here at the top of the screen, Bird Call. Early in the film, Jimmy Stewart is doing his bird call imitations. I can't do them, but he's arranging his fingers in whichever configuration, and he's doing his bird calls. And the press captured photos of him at that moment. And so then you see the pictures showing up in the next day's headlines with the caption reading that Mr. Smith gets his first whiff of Washington. So that was clearly a little satirical jab at press manipulation. So the press was not too thrilled, just as some politicians were not too thrilled with the film. But again, this was the preview screening. The actual premiere proved that the film would become a box office hit. It made a profit of $2 million, which in 1939 dollars is pretty darn good. U.S. Ambassador Joe Kennedy, I don't know how true this story is, but at least as the story goes, U.S. Ambassador Joe Kennedy actually reportedly approached Columbia head Harry Cohn and offered him money to buy the film from him, all existing prints of the film, so that he could destroy the film. Fortunately, the Columbia said, no, we're not selling the negative. We made this film, we're keeping it, we're going to continue to screen it. And Lucky for us they did, because we have it today. Jimmy Stewart really escaped most of the negative publicity, fortunately for him. Frank Capra took really the bulk of the criticism. In fact, there was concern that there might be some punitive legislation passed, some anti-Hollywood sentiment. Frank Capra, unfortunately, sort of passed the buck, and rather than saying, yes, it's my film, and like it or lump it, he instead said, hey, if you're taking issue with the film, don't talk to me. Go talk to Sidney Buckman, who wrote the final draft of the screenplay. He's a member of the Communist Party. So a little bit of, throwing somebody under the bus there. That was Frank Capra to the screenwriter, Sidney Buckman. So I have here, haha, corny joke, Jimmy Stewart getting all surprised because he got an Oscar nomination for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This was a Best Leading Actor nomination. We'll talk again more about the Oscars at the end when we get to the film. I do have one final little anecdote. Actually, anecdote's not the right word, but one final story about this film. This is the French poster for the film. When the film began playing overseas, in Europe specifically, this was, the Nazi Party was spreading throughout Europe and gobbling up more and more territory. When the Nazis went into France, they imposed a 30-day warning. They said, in 30 days, the following will go into effect. No U.S. films are to be exhibited. A ban on U.S. films, which would go into effect in 30 days. There was one small French village, a suburb of Paris, that, in a very symbolic gesture, played Mr. Smith Goes to Washington every single day, every single one of those 30 days until the ban went into effect. I always found that to be a very inspiring story. The power of democracy, as well as the power of art to shape and influence the way people see the world. So that is what I have to say about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Taking a look here at the time. Okay, so Wizard of Oz is next. Follow the Yellow Brick Road. Well, I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with the story of the Wizard of Oz. No need to go too much into the plot. Although if you step back and really think about it, this is a really strange movie. Like if you really, objectively think of a movie about tornadoes, a movie about your house landing on someone and killing that person, crushed by glass and lumber, and then her own sister doesn't even care. All she wants is the shoes. And then your best friend gets set on fire twice, the Scarecrow. And this is really strange stuff. You have to wonder, hey, I got a great idea for a musical. But, these are just some of the plot pieces of The Wizard of Oz. The story was written by L. Frank Baum. It is said that he was a storyteller well known in his neighborhood. He, every Sunday afternoon, would tell his kids, as well as the neighborhood kids, different stories. The Wizard of Oz was one of them. And as he was sort of improvised, this is as the story goes at least, he was sort of improvising the beginnings of what would eventually become the wonderful Wizard of Oz. And one of the kids allegedly asked him, well, what's the name of this magical land that Dorothy went to? Legend has it that he looked over to his filing cabinet and saw the labeling, saw the O through the Z, and said Oz. And is that true? Is it not? I don't think we'll ever know, but it does make for a great story. So as far as the name Dorothy, it is said that he named the leading character Dorothy after his baby niece Dorothy, who died in infancy. And again, there's no proof that that's why he chose the name, but also point to yes. The book was published in May of 1900. Unfortunately for Baum, he was not a businessman. He basically lost all his money. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and its subsequent sequels, they're popular, they sold well. Unfortunately, he did not make good decisions with his investments. He invested in failed stage productions and flop movies. He even saw an island off the coast of California decades before Disneyland, and he was envisioning basically land, and that fell through. pretty penny, 62, a full 20 years before. But, well, this anyway, the 1939 one we're all familiar with. There was a silent film version, which was a flop. Actually, written by his son.
Frank, can I interrupt for a second?
Entire film.
So, Frank,
yes.
For some reason, all of a sudden, you've gotten a little choppy, or you're breaking up a little bit. So I don't know if anything in the last 60 seconds has changed on your end, but you're breaking up a little bit on us.
I did not change, but I will. How am I sounding now? Am I okay now?
Sounding better. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. If I'm if the sound is bad. Silent film version, it was a flop. Notable though, because Oliver Hardy of Laurel and Hardy played the Tin Woodsman. And 20 years later, in the late 1930s, the musical was to production. Shirley Temple, who was 10 at the time, was MGM's first choice. She was under contract with 20th Century Fox. An agreement could not be reached. Enter Judy Garland and Louis B. Mayer of MGM, the first M of MGM, was not a nice man. I saw an article title in doing my research for this that said that Judy Garland was dealing with her own Harvey Weinstein with Louis B. Mayer. And for all intents and purposes, that does sound accurate. You know, insulting, inappropriate comments he would make about her physicality. The fact Judy Garland's well documented the fact that the studio would have her go on these diets, or make her take these, get her addicted to these medications to keep energy up, and they're also got involved with as well. But that's life story. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but that is, in addition to Shirley Temple playing Dorothy, the Wizard was almost played by Ed Wynn, who was a stage actor who wanted top billing. MGM said, well, you're not going to get top billing, and so he walked. It was then offered to W.C. Fields, who demanded money. They said no, more money than they were willing to offer. And that's how Frank Morgan was cast in the role. He plays the Wizard. He plays the guard at the door, and he plays the carriage driver as they're singing "The Wonderful Land of Oz." So Frank Morgan playing all. Ray, who is of course the Scarecrow, was originally cast as, and Buddy Epson was cast as the Scarecrow. They agreed to switch roles. Unfortunately for Buddy Epson, who is now the Tin Man, it turned out he was allergic to the makeup, the aluminum dust in the makeup, so he was out of the movie. Because Ray Bolger now had his contract signed, he is the Scarecrow. So that's when Jack Haley came in to play the Tin Woodsman. Reluctantly, he was not too thrilled. Meanwhile, Ray Bolger, he got the character he hoped to play, in which he felt he could show off his agility, which he certainly does. Some creations, a different color. They used Jello crystals. They had to film the scene as quickly as possible because the horses apparently enjoyed licking the crystals off of their, off of themselves. So that, of course, would cause a disgusting, gooey mess. So think of that next time you see this scene. That's how they got them to be, different colors. As far as the special effects, they were actually pretty impressive. The house falling through the sky with a tornado, what you see in the movie and what you see right here is actually film in reverse. They took a little model of the house and they took the camera, they got on top of a platform or a ladder, and they dropped the model house to the ground, and then they just reversed the film. So what you're seeing is a film in reverse of them saying, yoink, and down it goes. pretty ingenious. You probably have heard that Margaret Hamilton, who plays the Wicked Witch of the West, and Miss Gulch, used to be a kindergarten teacher. So could you imagine being a teenager maybe in 1939, you're seeing The Wizard of Oz and you're saying, is that Miss Hamilton? Is that my old kindergarten teacher? Interesting. I would have loved to have, I would love to know if that ever happened with anybody. If anybody said, I think that's my old kindergarten teacher. She gave me my snack pack. But yeah, no, she had left teaching to go into, for a career in Hollywood. I loved it. I had to include this picture of her. This is after the filming of Wizard of Oz. This is on the set of another movie she did, where she plays a maid. They reunited her with the dog who played Toto, so she agreed for this. She agreed to this publicity shot, which I love. Unfortunately, Margaret Hamilton also was not treated too kindly. She was not this queen on a pedestal. Let's just put it that way. Her was not she didn't would have to give her food, feed her, that she would not get any of the makeup. She would not, swallow any of it. So lunchtime was not fun. In addition to that, real life disaster occurred. If you see here, this is Munchkinland. And if you remember in the film, she appears and disappears in a puff of red and orange smoke. And the way that she disappeared is she went to this marked spot on the floor, and the floor was supposed to give way, a trap door, and she would fall below into a net or of some kind. But when they were rehearsing the scene, the trapdoor malfunctioned and it did not drop. So she was still there when they shut up the flames. And the makeup had copper in it, so she suffered third-degree burns all over her face and all over her hands. And the studio really didn't give her too much of a concern. She went home for a few weeks for medical treatment and to recover. The studio did call her to find out how much longer she'd be out. When are you coming back? You're holding things up. Her doctor, back in the days when house calls were a thing, her doctor is said to have grabbed the phone from her and yell at the studio head saying, if she does not sue you, then she is a fool. And she said, oh no, she said, if I sue MGM, they will cancel my contracts. I will be blacklisted. I will never work again. And you know what? She was right. That's probably exactly what would have happened. So she chose not to sue because she chose to keep working instead. But The Wizard of Oz went on to become an indelible classic. Speaking only for my generation, at least, annual showings on television before the days of home video. I remember it being a big family event. We would send off a pizza and it would be Wizard of Oz night. And then home video came around and now we're all spoiled rotten because we can just watch it whenever we darn well feel like it. But Oscar nominations, and this is the cast reacting. So congrats. Moving into Stagecoach, just checking the time. Okay, Stagecoach got its start as a short story called Stage to Lordsburg. John Ford's son brought it to his father. He brought it to John Ford, the director, and said, this is a good story, Dad. You might want to have this be your next movie. The thing of it is that John Ford, who was known for, he is known as the director of Westerns, quote unquote. But interestingly enough, he never, even though that might have been the statement he would offer, the label he would give himself, in interviews later on in life, he would always say, I'm not particularly interested in the Western per se. I just like good stories. Stagecoach was sound Western. He had made Westerns during the silent film era. And he had said that for him, the two most beautiful images that anybody could ever capture on film, a dancing couple and a galloping horse. He said those are the two most beautiful moving images that film can ever capture. His son brings in the short story Stagecoach. He sees potential. He brings it to the studios. They all say no because they say to him, no one makes Westerns anymore. By that point, Westerns had been a big thing during the silent era, but by the late 1930s, they were still being made, of course, but they weren't the bread and butter of the Hollywood film industry anymore. They had become cliche. They had become passé. So the studios were not willing to invest in this production. I won't get too much into this, but there is a short story called The Outcasts of Polka Flat, written in the 1800s, and there are a lot of similarities between The Outcasts of Polka Flat and Stagecoach, both in the storyline as well as the characters. So that's just a little reading recommendation for you if you're interested in looking it up, The Outcasts of Polka Flat. It is in the public domain, so you can find the full text online. The author is Bret Hart, with an E at the end. But getting back to Stagecoach, John Ford had really hit his stride. It was an 18-month period where he was directing some really great films. Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk, Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and of course, Stagecoach. And all these movies were released within an 18-month time span, 1939 to late 1939 to early 41. So, he already knew John Wayne, real name Marion Morrison. He actually asked him, hey, do you know anybody who could play the leading character in this movie I'm doing, Stagecoach? He wanted John Wayne, but he was sort of baiting him to see if John Wayne would bite. And John Wayne said, yeah, Lloyd Nolan, he'd be perfect. I don't know who Lloyd Nolan is. I've never seen any Lloyd Nolan films, but Wayne liked him. David O. Selznick, an independent producer, he agreed to finance the film as long as Gary Cooper played the lead. Once again, Gary Cooper. But long story short, John Wayne got the role, and John Ford, in typical John Ford style, used bullying tactics to get exactly what he wanted from his actors in the way of a performance. And he apparently at one point turned to Wayne and said, too bad you never learned to act. You'd get better parts if you did. There was another point where the sound guy turned to John Ford after a take and said to him, I don't like the way he delivered that line. And so John Ford, in response, apparently walked up to John Wayne, grabbed him by the chin and said to him, act with your eyes, not with your mouth. So bullying tactics that, who knows how it would have gone over these days. John Wayne and the female lead in the film, Claire Trevor, the two of them were both B actors at the time. They weren't, studio stars, but they were recognizable faces. John Wayne being called a big oaf. But John Wayne, in response to all of this, said, you know what? Ford knew what he was doing. He knew how to get out of me what he was hoping for in terms of a performance. And he knew how embarrassed I was to be a B movie star in Westerns, to be a cop, when Westerns were so passé at that point. He knew that I wanted more out of a career, so I appreciate what he was doing in terms of, pushing me and pushing me and pushing me. That was John Wayne's take on it. Claire Trevor was the big name, quote unquote, in the cast, so she actually earned the highest salary. I mean, you take a look at that discrepancy there, it's actually pretty interesting. $3,700 for Wayne as opposed to $15,000 for Claire Trevor. But again, they were both B-level actors, so she probably would have earned more had she been considered at the time an A-list actor. There's an interview. It's actually, you can see this interview if you get the Criterion Collection DVD edition of Stagecoach. One of the special features is an interview from 1968, a British journalist asking John Ford some questions. I have here just a few snippets from that interview. He said, John Ford said, I don't consider myself a film aficionado. For me, it's just a way of making a living. He says, I don't consider myself, particularly drawn to Westerns. I like to make Westerns because I like to get out and live out in the open, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. And he said himself, none of my so-called better pictures are Westerns. Years later, in the early 50s, he would do The Quiet Man. And he said, every time you have a really good film that you make, always with a smaller film rather than trying to replicate your success, because it will always fall short of expectations. So after Stagecoach, he did smaller film. After The Quiet Man, he did a small film called The Sun Shines Bright. And the interesting thing is that in this interview, John Ford said that out of all of his movies, the one he is most proud of, his favorite, is The Sun Shines Bright, which also is in the public domain. So if you'd like to see The Sun Shines Bright, just go onto YouTube and you'll find it there, 1953. The movie itself was shot in Monument Valley, Arizona, and he basically used this same stretch of land to depict a stagecoach journey that was supposed to go from one state to another. He just kept reusing the same background, just shooting it from different angles. I always compare it to how in the old animation they used to have the same background repeating, looping over and over again. It was similar to that. Take a look here. One of the more troubling aspects of Stagecoach is two troubling things. One of them is, and this isn't just Stagecoach, it's really the movie industry in general. Before you had, the Humane Association, animals were not treated the way that they are today in terms of just monitoring that no animal is harmed. These horses, they would have attached to their legs, not just Stagecoach, a lot of Westerns, they would take wires and they would attach them to the horse's legs. And anytime they wanted to depict the horse rider getting shot and then falling off the horse, the way that they would achieve that effect is by having the horse gallop, and then the horse would jerk back once the tripwire was stretched, and then the rider would go tumbling down to the ground, and that would give the effect of having been shot. That was very fortunately not happen anymore. Stagecoach had its premiere at Radio City Music Hall, and which is very good for the film. A film that has such grand, broad, sweeping images, the whole Monument Valley, the zoom-ins, the widescreen of Radio City Music Hall was the ideal choice for Stagecoach. So Stagecoach went on to become a hit. It would firmly establish John Wayne as a bona fide movie star above B-level material, and it would become one of the classics of the genre, arguably along the lines of other classics such as The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Pick a Western, any of the so-called greatest Westerns ever, and Stagecoach usually will be included in that list. Last but not least, Gone with the Wind. So the one that became the movie to beat in 1939. So I definitely knew that this one had to be the one to save for last. The credited director is Victor Fleming. It went through a series of directors. What can be said about Gone with the Wind? A lot, but I will keep it focused and I will keep it as succinct but as informative as possible. It got its start as a book. There was a woman by the name of Margaret Mitchell. She was a housewife in Georgia, and in the mid-1920s, she suffered an ankle injury, her third. She kept re-injuring the same ankle. So as she was recovering, her husband would come home every day. He would go to the library for her, and he would come home every day with books for her to read. She was an avid reader, and when she pretty much exhausted the library's supply of books, she said, "There's nothing left. Come on, there's got to be more." And he said to her, apparently, what he said to her was, "Listen, if you want another book, write it yourself." And that's exactly what she did. So that's how Gone with the Wind got its start. Had she never injured her ankle, who knows? Who knows what could have been? The original title she was working with was Tomorrow's Another Day, which of course has become one of the movie's most quoted lines of dialogue. Scarlett O'Hara, Scarlett's original name was Pansy. She got the name Tara, the plantation, Scarlett O'Hara's plantation Tara. The name Tara she got from Ireland, from a plantation in Ireland that she was familiar with. When she finished her book and when it was published, it was a huge, huge literary sensation. Bestseller for several years, and it was inevitable that Hollywood would come knocking, seeking the movie rights. So once the movie rights were, once agreements were, and once MGM had the MGM and producer David O. Selznick were getting ready to put the film into production, I love this. She had a suggestion for who she felt would be the ideal choice, the perfect choice to play Rhett Butler. Her suggestion was not Clark Gable. You ready for this one? If I were in my classroom right now with my students, I'd be saying, drum roll, please. Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx was Margaret Mitchell's suggestion. She felt he would be the perfect Rhett Butler. The Marx brothers, that Groucho Marx. The studio and David said, we'll pass. And so she didn't win that particular round. MGM actually passed on the script at first. They were nervous that it was not really too marketable of a film. How can we make a movie in the late 1930s when Europe is on the brink of war with all of its political turmoil that we could very well become involved in ourselves? Who wants to see a Civil War picture now? Talk about bad timing. On top of that, when the leading characters of films were supposed to have redeeming qualities, or they were supposed to be the heroes of their stories, or at least learn their lessons in the end. And Scarlett O'Hara, I mean, it's debatable. It's debatable. She's not a bad person, but she certainly is narcissistic. Clark Gable, Rhett Butler, I should say. Rhett Butler, a scheming war profiteer, so he's not exactly the most upstanding citizen. You have hints of extramarital affairs. I mean, Scarlett O'Hara in love with the married Ashley Wilkes, played by Leslie Howard, even after he was married. And then everything else ranging from depictions of the slaves or the former slaves, to the depictions of really male-female dynamics. The famous image of Rhett Butler drunk carrying Scarlett O'Hara when she is protesting, carrying her up the stairs to their bedroom. I think it's safe to say that a scene like that, as iconic as it may be, something tells me that it would not go over too well if it were to appear in a movie these days. David O. Selznick, who was the independent producer, he negotiated with MGM. They agreed to fund part of the film in turn for a percentage of the profits. There's David O. Selznick right there. Little side note about David O. Selznick. I've had people ask me, what did the O stand for? He inserted the because he had the same name as an uncle that he strongly disliked. So he wanted to differentiate himself from his not so beloved uncle. But that's neither here nor there. What can I tell you about the legendary search for the character of Scarlett O'Hara? I could go on for 3 hours. I won't. I just have here a list of some names. Practically every actress in Hollywood read for the part. Katharine Hepburn really wanted it. David O. Selznick allegedly said to her, I cannot imagine Rhett Butler pursuing you for 10 years. Screen tests that went nowhere for you see in the screen. Joan Fontaine, Olivia de Havilland's sister. Now, for those of you who might not know, Olivia de Havilland, who is still alive and with us, God love her, 104 years old, she'll be next month. Olivia de Havilland, she and Joan Fontaine, real-life sisters, lifelong sibling rivalry. Joan Fontaine read for the role of Scarlett. Can you imagine if these two sisters co-starred in this movie in which their characters are vying for the same? I wouldn't want to touch that one. There is also a story of Lucille Ball, wanting the role. She was running late for her audition, and it happened to be an extremely rainy day. So when she showed up and checked in at David O. Selznick's office, her hair was dripping wet and she was soaked, and she was let into his office. He was not in his office yet, so she was left alone to wait for him. And she decided, well, while I'm waiting, let me just practice a little bit more. So she's reading the script, and with nobody else in the room, she's acting out which it was. She gets down on her knees at one point, reading the lines, when all of a sudden she hears this voice behind her saying, "That was very good, Miss Ball." She turns, it's David O. Selznick, and she did not hear him approaching her from behind. She got up all flustered, and he said, no, keep going, keep going. So as the story goes, she kept going. Of course, she did not get the role. Vivien Leigh did. But Lucille Ball, let's face it, she was not hurting. She has her fame. She certainly has made her mark on the entertainment industry for the ages with her television fame. Bette Davis had said there was absolute insanity that she did not get the role of Scarlett O'Hara, but she was under contract with Warner Brothers. I'll cut through a little bit of this here. So she and Warner Brothers decided to basically, how can I put it, to get their revenge first. In other words, they're getting even first. Before anything is done to them, they're going to do something to MGM. So Warner Brothers rushed into production a film that had very striking similarities to Gone with the Wind, and it was released 1 year before Gone with the Wind. The film, Jezebel. Bette Davis plays a spoiled, tempestuous, Southern belle, very much like Scarlett O'Hara. Take a look at the title, Jezebel. And the funny thing is that this movie, which came out in 1938, she got an Academy Award for Best Leading Actress. She won the Oscar for Jezebel 1 year before Gone with the Wind. So that was, Bette Davis's part in all of this. As far as some behind-the-scenes anecdotes, I can tell you this. The Burning of Atlanta, this was filmed before the role of Scarlett O'Hara was cast. Vivien Leigh had not yet signed on the dotted line, but the production could not be delayed any longer. This was one of the first scenes filmed. And what I love about this is that you take a look here, take a look at that structure that's burning. Talk about killing two birds with one stone. The studio said, you know what? If we have to burn down a building, why build something just to burn it down? Talk about a waste of money. Let's save money. And so what they ended up burning down, next time you see this movie and watch this scene, think of this. What you're watching burn down in this scene, they are burning down the old set used in King Kong, the island of the lost souls in King Kong. They're burning down the entrance, the gated entrance. That's what's burning down here, the facade, the skeleton, if you will, of that old King Kong set. So I always loved that piece of trivia. Paulette Goddard, who was romantically involved with Charlie Chaplin at the time, she was this close to getting the role of Scarlett O'Hara. She was the final choice, but the morals clauses that I mentioned previously, she was living with Charlie Chaplin and they were not married. MGM knew that that was going to be a problem with the production code. So they said to her, go to City Hall, get married, bring us back the marriage certificate, and then the role is yours. We can sign on the dotted line. Out of principle, she said, I am not going to get married simply for a movie role. So that's why she ended up losing the role of Scarlett. Vivien Leigh eventually did. And the interesting thing is that Vivien Leigh was actually having an affair with Laurence Olivier at the time. So how is it that she was able to escape such scrutiny of her personal life? Your guess is as good as mine. Your guess is as good as mine. But the fact is that Paulette Goddard was this close, but out of personal principle, she walked, and Vivien Leigh benefited from that. They used a special lighting filter on the camera. Vivien Leigh's eyes were blue, but in the book they're described as green. So they used a special filter on the camera to make her eyes green. in that scene that you have. This is later on in the film when she's sitting with Melanie. But Vivien Leigh really benefited from the morals clauses in the contracts during the studio system. Again, who knows what might have been had it been otherwise. Clark Gable, he did not want to play the role of Rhett Butler. He knew that the book had a massive following, and he said, you know what, I don't have enough confidence that I'll be able to pull it off. Fans wrote in saying, oh no, do it. He was self-conscious that he would not be able to pull off a Southern accent, so he refused. And Louis B. Mayer said, okay, no problem. Don't do a Southern accent. That's why Rhett Butler has no accent, no Southern accent, because Clark Gable didn't want to do it. Clark Gable was married at the time, but he was involved with Carole Lombard, and the studio said to him, just as they said to Paulette Goddard, Charlie Chaplin's live-in girlfriends, okay, we know it's Hollywood's worst kept secret. We know that you're married, but that you and Carole Lombard are seeing each other. So are you going to divorce your wife? So Clark Gable signed, and with the money, well, with some of the money he made from Gone with the Wind, he obtained a divorce from his wife, and now he and Carole Lombard were free to be seen in public at restaurants and movie premieres, and everything was okay in terms of the morals clause. As far as just a couple of final pieces of information, yeah, Cliff Edwards plays a wounded Confederate soldier in the film. He's the voice of Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio. And in another Hey, Did You Know piece of information, Barbara O'Neill, who plays Scarlett O'Hara's mother, was only 3 years older than Vivien Leigh was at the time. There you have them right there. So, but keep in mind that the film takes place over the span of a number of years. And George Reeves, he was one of Scarlett O'Hara's gentleman callers in the very first scene. George Reeves would later on in life achieve immortality in television history. There he is right there as one of the gentleman callers. And he, of course, would go on to become TV's Superman in the 1950s. So he is, he's one of the two gentleman callers in the first few scenes of the film, vying for Scarlett O'Hara's hand. George Cukor was the original director, but he was fired, and so he went off to go make The Women, which also starred Butterfly McQueen. And so when he was fired, that caused a lot of turmoil on the set. Both Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland secretly would go to his house on the weekends, where he would secretly continue to direct them, give them some advice and some input as far as how to read a certain line or how to work a certain scene. Basically, he continued to direct them from his own home on the weekends. But he found out about it at the time, you know, it certainly would have spelled a lot of trouble. As far as Butterfly McQueen, who actually, I think, led an extremely interesting life. She got a bachelor's degree in political science when she was 64 years old in 1975. And for decades, she was always talking about how much she hated her character in the film. She felt that the character of Prissy was demeaning. She said the character was always whining and complaining. Eventually, though, before she died in the mid-90s, she did reach a point where she said, okay, I can now say I'm glad that I made the film because I make a living off it. So she did eventually come to terms with it, but she always felt conflicted about playing the character. Couple of things about her that are worth mentioning. The fact that she, and this was for 1939, this was very bold of her and good for her. She said to the director, there are two things that I absolutely refuse to do, and if you need to fire me, fire me. She said, number one, she said, I am not going to eat watermelon on screen. I will not perpetuate that stereotype. So that was the first condition that she put out there. And that was a really risky thing to do. Needless to say, she wouldn't have had much leverage. But she refused and they agreed. They said, okay, the watermelon is out. And she said, and something else, number two, The scene when probably her biggest scene, when she says repeatedly, I don't know nothing about birthing no babies, end quote, when Melanie is going into labor. Scarlett O'Hara, in the script, Scarlett slaps her and she screams, Prissy screams. And Butterfly McQueen said, I'm going to give you a choice. She said, you're not going to get both. If you really want her to slap me, if you want the real slap, fine, but you're not going to get a scream out of me. She said, if you want me to scream, she said, that it has to be a fake slap. I refuse both. I refuse to agree to both. And what they chose the fake slap and the scream that you do hear in the film, which I think, again, we have to think of this in the context of the times. I think that was very, very bold and very, again, good for her, very admirable of Butterfly McQueen to say, you know what, I don't like this and I don't like that. The word damn, which has become legendary. Clark Gable, Rhett Butler saying, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. They had to pay a fine of, I think offhand how much it was. It was either 10, was it 10,000? They had to pay an exorbitant amount of money in order for the production office to agree to allow the word damn to be used. It is the word David O'Sullivan wrote to the censorship board saying, we really need this line. The power of the scene depends on it. And I really don't think it's going to lead the movie industry into any bad directions. As long as the upshot was they paid a fine, the word damn stayed in, and most iconic lines of the film, not to mention of movie history, was in. The premiere was held in Atlanta, Georgia at the Lowe's Grand Theater, December. It was a segregated theater, and so Butterfly McQueen and Hattie McDaniel both could not attend. Clark Gable said, I will not attend. If they are not going, I am not going. Interestingly, Hattie McDaniel, and the two of them became very good friends. They had a lot of respect for each other. Hattie McDaniel turns to Clark Gable, and she insisted that he go. So ultimately, he agreed. She said, you go, you represent the film, you represent all of us. She said, you go. So he went, and the next day, the book's author, Margaret Mitchell, she wrote to Hattie McDaniel personally and said, the mayor called for a hand for you, and I wish you could have heard the cheers. So they were not present at the premiere, but there were apparently accolades given out to them. The building itself, the theater, just as a side note, in the 70s, it was destroyed in a fire. It's an office building now, so if any of you are familiar with the Georgia Pacific Tower in Atlanta, Georgia, that was the former location of the Lowe's Grand Theater in Atlanta, where the Gone with the Wind premiere was held. And wrapping this up with Hattie McDaniel, she had a very different take on the film than Butterfly McQueen. Hattie McDaniel's words, and she said in a 1947 piece that she wrote, she said, I have never apologized for the roles I play. I have persuaded at times directors to cut out some dialogue, and they've agreed. She says, I think that my critics think the public is more naive than it actually is. I've been told that I keep alive stereotypes, but I don't think so, she says. That was 1947, what she said then. She did refer to this British actor, Arthur Treacher, who was most known for butler roles. She said, I highly doubt that anybody would show up to his home in real life expecting him to answer the door with a towel on his arm, which I thought was an interesting analogy for her to make. So, I mean, agree with her, disagree with her, but again, that's what she said in 1947. And here they are, running towards the Oscars. Here you have Olivia de Havilland as Melanie, and you have Leslie Howard as Ashley Wilkes, and they are running towards Gone with the Wind's Oscar sweeps. So the big night, February 29th, 1940. I'm just doing a quick time check. Bob Hope was the MC at the Coconut Grove, and Best Supporting Actor went to Thomas Mitchell for Stagecoach. He played the character Doc Boone in Stagecoach. Stagecoach, Best Music. And in his acceptance speech, he said, "I didn't know I was quite that good." So, Best Supporting Actor of 1939, Thomas Mitchell for Stagecoach. He was also in Gone with the Wind. He plays Scarlett O'Hara's father in Gone with the Wind. Best Supporting Actress that year went to Hattie McDaniel, who plays Mammy in Gone with the Wind. And in her acceptance speech, she said, "This is one of the happiest moments of my life." Olivia de Havilland, who played Melanie, was nominated in the same category. She admitted that she was heartbroken that she did not win, but later on she says, "I got over myself and realized it was wonderful for Hattie McDaniel to win." Of course, Olivia de Havilland would go on to win 2 Oscars throughout her career, so everybody was happy. And of course, Best Leading Actress went to Vivien Leigh, which was not a surprise for anybody. She said, "Please forgive me if my words are inadequate in thanking you for your very great kindness." Acceptance speeches certainly have evolved over the decades. So she used the Oscar as a bathroom doorstop, just as a little FYI. She became a 2-time Academy Award winner when all was said and done career-wise, and she used one of her Oscars for her bathroom doorstop. Best Leading Actor was Robert Donat for Goodbye, Mr. Chips. He was not present because he always had a conflicted relationship with Hollywood, so the producer of the film accepted the Best Leading Actor Oscar on his behalf. It did not go to Clark Gable or to Jimmy Stewart. The 2 of them were considered the shoo-ins, so it's likely that Robert Donat benefited from a split vote. Jimmy Stewart, although he didn't win for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which got Best Original Story, he did win for the Philadelphia Story. He did win for the Philadelphia Story the following year, and he said that he felt he didn't deserve it. He felt it was more of a, they're throwing me a bone because they think I should have won last year for Mr. Smith. He felt the role in Mr. Smith had more guts. He said it should have gone to Henry Fonda for Grapes of Wrath. When I won for Philadelphia Story, it should have gone to Henry Fonda, he felt. They were good friends in real life. Clark Gable, when Robert Donat's name was read off, Clark Gable, he did not win, and he is said to have sat there sulkily for a bit. And Carol Lombard, his girlfriend, apparently, again, so the story goes, she turned to him and said, "There is always next year." He turns to her and responded, "I don't think so. I think this was my last chance at winning an Oscar." She then turned to him and said to him, "I was talking about me." I love that. So that was her little jab in the ribs, if you will, to Clark Gable. So that was probably what she was saying to herself. Tomorrow is another day. So that is the distribution of Emmy Awards in February of 1940. Judy Garland was not eligible to compete for an Oscar because she was under 18. Children at the time were ineligible. So she got a miniature Oscar, a special recognition Oscar. The 2 wins for The Wizard of Oz went to Best Song for Over the Rainbow and Best Musical Score, which was different from Best Music Scoring that Stagecoach got. And of course, the Best Picture Oscar went to Gone with the Wind, the Best Picture Oscar winner of 1939. Did it deserve it? That's up to you. Like all art, cinema is, after all, subjective. But the fact is that 1939, for better or worse, rightly or wrongly, is regarded as Hollywood's finest year. So I have here, for the final slide here, again, just a recap, the 4 films that we looked at this evening. And again, that's my Twitter handle, FilmBuff1974. You can also join Silver Screeners on Facebook, where I post all things movie-related, past, present, and future. I usually double post. It's usually the same stuff posted to both. So I would invite you to grab a friend, and the more the merrier, to join these two pages. So again, I want to thank the Tewksbury Library. I want to thank Robert. I want to thank the Friends of the Library. I'm sorry if this went a little bit over, but I do want to stop talking now and allow time for any questions that there may be.
Don't worry about it, Frank. So we'll take maybe a handful of questions and then we'll call it a night. Diane left some comments in the chat. Diane mentioned that both Jack Haley and Ray Bolger were from Massachusetts. Sean had a comment, curious to see how many of these films would be made today if they were offered to studios today. What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's a fantastic question. I would say out of these four, I would say that the one most likely, given what's, you know, popular and trendy in films these days, I can easily see Mr. Smith being made today, but I think that it would be made with a much different tone. Rather than going with the sentiments, I can see it more going in the direction of satire, not necessarily changing the character of Mr. Smith, but rather than making him out to be the idealistic hero that we would want to be like, make him more to be the naive one who, throughout the course of the story, learns what's what in terms of how politics works. I think Mr. Smith out of these four, and this is just my own opinion, would be the most likely to be made. I think that if I had to pick a second one, I can see being made. Not necessarily for theatrical distribution. I can see Wizard of Oz either being one of the annual Fox Live musicals that they've been doing for the past number of years. I can see Wizard of Oz going in that route, and I can also see it being a movie made for to go direct to digital streaming. You know, a Netflix film, for example. I do think that there is a hunger out there for musicals, thanks to over the past 20 years, movies like Chicago and La La Land and even Sweeney Todd, which was obviously much darker. I think there has been a resurgence in the movie musical in the past 20 years. So I think Wizard of Oz would be made. Stagecoach and Gone with the Wind, I think that they would be told in a much different way. I think that a lot of the characters would either be changed or eliminated. Or at the very least, there might be disclaimers at the beginning of the film saying, you know, depicting, you know, history at the time, in terms of, you know, male-female dynamic, in terms of Hattie McDaniel's and Butterfly McQueen's characters. I don't know if Gone with the Wind would be made today. A Civil War era story, most certainly. One that's a melodrama, I'm not so sure.
Diane also mentions that Betty Davis was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, right next door to Tewksbury, and Diane thinks that Jezebel is a great movie. So did anyone have any other questions or comments for Frank? They can either type them into the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand and I can call on you, let you ask a question via video. Any takers? Diane says, great research, interesting to hear the backstories, thank you. Alicia wants to know if you have a podcast, Frank.
It's funny you should ask that. I'm in the process of putting one together now. I don't have one yet, but I've been doing my research and gathering my technology. And once I do have it up and running, I will be advertising it on both Twitter and Facebook.
All right, so Alicia, follow Frank on social media, okay? And you'll be the first to hear about his podcast. Got to come up with a catchy name, Frank, for your podcast.
I say I'm open to all suggestions, any and all suggestions.
There we go.
I'm not very good with titles.
That's all right. That's all right. Roseanne says thank you. Yep, thank you for coming,
thank
Roseanne.
you.
So, Frank, any last words you want to leave us with?
Keep watching movies. We need art more than ever, especially in times like this. You know, and not just drama, comedy too. We need all types of art. So the fact that you're here tonight means, I assume, that you love movies or at least enjoy hearing about them. Just keep the passion for the arts alive. That would be my big message.
All right, great. Sean says to stick with Silver Screeners as your podcast name. Ashley says this was awesome. Thank you, Frank and Robert. So guys, we're going to call it a night. I'm going to send an email tomorrow morning. Look for that. Please take the feedback survey. Greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you all at future Zoom programs here at the Tewksbury Library. Thanks again, and everyone have a great night. Okay. Thank you again, Frank.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a good one, guys.